Well, welcome to Module 2 of Practical Preaching. In this module, we're going to give you a few practical tips and pieces of advice to help you preach better, clearer, and more engaging sermons. And so we'll start with tip number 1. And it may seem obvious, but let me explain what I mean, and that's this. That you should know what you're going to say. You should actually know what you're going to say before you give your message or you give your sermon for the first time on a Sunday morning. And here's what I mean, because you may have a general idea of what you're going to say. Maybe you had a busy week and so you put it together, your sermon on Saturday night, and you kind of jotted a few notes down. But the first time you actually go over it, the first time it's really being internalized is when you're standing in front of your people giving your sermon. And when we do that, what happens is it leads us to not be as effective or as confident in what we're going to say. The first time that we ever actually internalize or go over our sermon, if we want it to be the most effective and clear as possible, should not be when we're standing in front of our people for the first time. It should be done before that, so that when we stand in the pulpit, when we stand on stage, we know how the sermon's going to flow, how it's going to go, and we're confident about what's actually going to be said. And so we want to know what we're going to say. We don't just want to guess. We don't just want to have an idea of like, well, in this section, I'll talk about this, and here I'll go over this story. No, we want to know ahead of time, before we're actually on stage, how the sermon is going to flow. We want to kind of internalize it and go over it beforehand, so when we're standing in front of our people, it's not the first time we've gone over it. Which leads us to point number 2, and this is one of the best ways that you can actually know what you're going to say before Sunday morning, and that's this: by rehearsing what you're going to say out loud. I am a big proponent, no matter have you been preaching for forever or you're about to give your first sermon in your entire life, of going over what you're going to say out loud before you actually give your message on a Sunday morning. Now, you don't have to do this in front of other people. It could just be you in a room, but I could not recommend it enough for a couple of reasons. Number 1, rehearsing what you're going to say out loud allows you to know how long your sermon actually is, right? There's nothing worse than being up there and realizing, oh, I've already gone 5 minutes more than the allotted time, or 5 minutes longer than how much I normally talk for, and I still have 3 more points to go, or I still have like 10 minutes worth of material, and it's the best material, and if I cut it, I can end the sermon on time, but people are going to miss the best stuff. Or, maybe you think you have gone through all of your stuff and you realize, oh, I still have 10 more minutes, right? In order to avoid that, if we go through what we're going to go through out loud, it allows us to know, okay, how long exactly is this going to be? So it can really show us if we need to add some stuff or if we need to cut some stuff. So that's one way it's beneficial. It's also beneficial, and maybe you've done this before, where you put your sermon together and you get ready to give it, and then you realize, oh, what I just said did not come across the way I thought it would come across. Or written down on paper, it's different than when I say it out loud. And so giving your sermon or talking through your sermon out loud allows you to hear, okay, does this joke make any sense? Or does this point land well, or do I need to tweak the wording? So going over your sermon out loud allows you to know how long it's going to be. It allows you to see, okay, how does this sound actually coming out of my mouth? And it allows you to familiarize yourself with your message. Now, I'm not going to say there's a particular magic number of times you should go over your sermon. For me, I normally go over it out loud over the course of a few days that week, 3 or 4 times. I think that you could go over it too much and then become robotic, which you don't want to do. But you also don't want to go over it, not go over it at all, because that's the best way to really internalize what you're going to say, is practice it out loud. And once you do it a few times, it no longer feels weird, and it allows you to really be confident in what you're going to say. So point number 2, rehearse what you're going to say. It's one of the best ways to let you actually know what you're going to say and how it's going to sound when you give your message. And here's point number 3. We need to understand and we need to know that too short is better than too long, which I know in preaching world may come across as kind of sacrilegious, or how dare we say that, but the reality is too short is better than too long. And maybe you've been in a situation like this where you're giving your sermon or your message and you look up and you're like, oh, I have a lot of time left. I'm just going to talk, or I'm just going to ramble. And the reality is, when we ramble, when we talk, when we're disorganized, and we don't really know what we're saying, that really takes away from the message that we've been given, or the message that we are giving to our people or to the audience. And so it is always better to go too short than too long. And plus, nobody's going to get mad at you for talking less, although they might get annoyed with you if you talk too long. And so I just want to say that as you prepare your sermon, sometimes, again, especially if you don't go through it out loud, you may not know how long it's going to be until you're actually giving it. But people would always prefer it be too short than too long, because rambling and going too long can really take away from a powerful or a convicting or a helpful message, because people begin to tune you out and stop listening. And the benefit also of going too short rather than too long is it can also lead people to think that you have more skill or that you're better than you actually are. The message was actually better than it was. It's always better to leave people wanting more than over-explain things and talking too long. So too short is better than too long. Here's point number 4, and this one is particularly helpful when it comes to giving more engaging sermons, and that's this, that you should not start your sermon with a welcome. Do not start with a welcome. Do not start with a thank you. Do not start with anything like that, which kind of goes against maybe what we've been taught or kind of our public speaking human nature, if you will. I mean, we've all been there. Maybe you've done it or we've heard people say it. As soon as the sermon starts, thank you so much for being here. We're so glad you're here today. You could be anywhere else, but you're here with us. Or maybe at a multi-site church where they welcome the different campuses or the different sites, or welcoming the people watching online, or thanking them to be there, or thanking them for tuning in. And here's the reality of the situation. You don't need to welcome people at the beginning of your message, because if they haven't been welcomed yet by your serve teams and through the flow of the service, you welcoming them then is not really going to make up for it. So we shouldn't feel the pressure of having to welcome people at the beginning of our message, because it's not going to make people feel welcomed if they haven't already. And also, nobody needs to be thanked for being there. And here's why this is important. Because the first few minutes of your message, the first few minutes of your sermon, is the only time that you have everybody's undivided attention. It's the only time that no one's asleep yet. It's the only time that no one's distracted yet. It is the only time where you can actually draw and pull people in. And so the question is, would you rather spend that first 1 to 2 minutes welcoming people and thanking them for being here, or by using that first 1 or 2 minutes to draw people in to what you're going to say, to encourage them to listen, to want to know more? Now, I'm not saying you can't welcome people. We're not saying you can't thank people. We're not saying you can't introduce yourself or anything like that. But you can do it a few minutes into the message. It doesn't have to be right at the beginning. So instead of starting your message with a welcome or a thank you, you should just go right into it. Think of it like a concert, right? You ever been to a concert or a rock concert, and the featured band, the featured performer comes on stage? What do? They don't say, "I'm so glad you're here." They don't say, "Thank you for making the trip out tonight." No, normally there's smoke and there's lights and there's a lot of momentum and energy, because that's how they start the show. They want to draw people in. I'm not saying you need to have smoke and lights and be playing loud music, but you need to draw people in. And here's some effective ways that you can do that. Instead of welcoming people, you can start with attention. You can ask them a question that they want to get resolved, right? You can propose a question and say, okay, as we go through today, we're going to answer this question. And then people are like, oh, I want to know the answer to that question, so I'm going to listen. Or if you can get people to laugh or agree with you, that is another way to draw them in. When people laugh, their defenses come down and they're more likely to listen. Or if you can talk about a common point that everybody agrees with, then their defenses are down, they want to hear more, and they're already more apt to listen to what you want to say. So instead of starting your sermon with a welcome or a thank you, start it with a question that provides tension. Maybe give an illustration that kind of lightens the mood and kind of brings people's defenses down by telling a joke, if that is appropriate for the sermon that you're going to give. Or kind of just talk about something that everybody agrees with and go from there. Don't waste the first few minutes of your message. Go right into your message from the beginning. It may feel weird the first couple of times you do it, but I promise you, your people will be more engaged, and it'll begin to feel a lot more normal the more and more you do it. So point number 4, don't start with a welcome. Start with something engaging to keep people drawn in, because that is the only chance you have to get everybody on the same page is in the beginning of the message, because it's the only time that everyone's actually listening. Here's point number 5. Point number 5 is this. You should know your bottom line. In other words, the talk that you give, the message, the sermon that you give should have a central point to it. And here's why this is helpful. This is not to say that you can't have multiple points in your sermon, not to say that you can't have multiple illustrations or multiple things you want people to know from the message. But the best thing you can do is give people a bottom line, be very clear that this is the biggest thing that you want them to take away, so that when they leave after the service, everybody's on the same page and you actually get to tell them the most important thing, right? Because otherwise, when people leave, they might not really be able to articulate what the message was about. Or if you say, hey, if someone, at lunch, hey, what was the message about today? People can give different answers. But if you have a well-crafted bottom line that really draws people in, that sums up the point of the message that day, you can help people leave knowing exactly what you want them to know. It can be a sentence, it can be a few words, but you want to give something sticky and memorable. Again, it's not to say you can't have multiple points. It's not to say you can't have multiple things that you want people to walk away with. But the best thing you can do is to kind of bring all of your message into a central theme, into a central bottom line, so when they leave, it sticks with them throughout the week. So again, have multiple points, have multiple things you want to say, but I couldn't encourage you enough to have a bottom line for every single message, kind of a main point that you want to drive home for every single message. And the reality of the situation is, if you don't know the bottom line of your message, nobody else will either. If you don't know the main point that you're trying to get across in your message, nobody else will either, which means that you and I need to do the hard work of trying to figure out what exactly that is. And this works for both topical messages and more exegetical messages when you're going verse by verse through the scripture. At the end of the day, at the end of the message, what is the main thing you want people to take away? Tell them that, be clear about it. That way that they can take away and apply what it is that you want them to know from that message. So point number 5, to help you preach clear, better, and more engaging sermons, is know your bottom line, have your bottom line, and be very clear about what it is. So as people are leaving, they know exactly what the message was about that day. Which leads to the last point of this module, point number 6. And this is more of a phrase, and I'll explain what I mean, but it's this: that nobody cares how much you know until you tell a story. No one cares how much you know until you tell a story. And here's what I mean: that stories and illustrations are the most impactful way for us to communicate the truths that we want people to walk away with. After all, Jesus, what did he do? Primarily taught in stories and parables so that things were memorable for the people. And you've been there, I've been there, when people say, I don't really remember much about the sermon, but they start to tell you all the stories that you shared. And it can be frustrating because it's like, well, that was a story that wasn't like the point of what I was trying to say. And so here's how this is helpful. Instead of just telling stories to be engaging or to draw people in, that we should be strategic about coupling stories with the main points we're trying to get across. Let me give you an example. This summer at New City Church, we went through the 10 Commandments, and one of the commandments is remember the Sabbath. Now, remember the Sabbath means two things. It doesn't just mean think about it. When God tells us to remember the Sabbath, he's also telling us to observe it or to do it. And so I told the story about how I love Jersey Mike's. It's a sub place, and I began to tell people my order and what they should, when I say, hey, when I like Jersey Mike's and this is my favorite type of sandwich, I was making the joke that I'm not just telling you this because I want you to know, like I actually want you to remember it. Like I actually want you to go and get it for me. And it was lighthearted and it was funny. And a couple days later, I was talking to a guy that was at the service, and he starts telling me, retelling the Jersey Mike story that I told. And he kind of felt bad. He's like, sorry, this is just the biggest thing that I remembered. And the thing that was so funny to me, and I didn't say this, but I was like, you have nothing to apologize for, because I was using that story about remembering my order from my favorite restaurant and tying it into remembering the Sabbath. And so my story helped make the point of the commandment and help people walk away with what the commandment actually means. And so when it comes to telling stories, it's not enough just to say, here's what the Bible says about this, or here's the bottom line, or here's what this point that I'm trying to make and I want you to understand and I want you to walk away with. If we really want people to walk away with a point or a bottom line, then we need to use a story and we need to use an illustration to help bring that point home. Which means, and if you're like me, you have a lot to work to do with becoming a better storyteller and using more illustrations. It's actually funny. The hardest thing for me, maybe you can relate to this, when it comes to writing messages, is not studying, is not explaining what the text means, is not kind of pulling out main points from the text, but it's actually making the sermon memorable and not boring. It's actually going through and say, okay, where am I going to put my stories? Where am I going to put my illustrations? Where am I going to break up this message so people can breathe, if you will, and re-engage in what I'm talking about? And so what we need to do is we actually need to spend a good amount of time making sure we have stories. They don't have to always be funny. They don't always have to be amazing. They just need to help people connect with what we're trying to say, which means, again, that nobody cares how much you know until you tell a story. If you really want people to connect with the main points and the bottom line and what you want them to walk away with from the message that day, then we've got to give stories and illustrations like Jesus did to make it more memorable. Again, nobody cares how much you know until you tell a story. And so let's be strategic about where and when we put stories to help us illustrate the points that we want people to walk away with from our sermons. And so again, those were the 6 points for preaching clearer and better and more engaging sermons. I'll say them again real quick. Number 1, know what you're going to say. Number 2, rehearse what you're going to say. Number 3, too short is better than too long. Number 4, don't start with a welcome. Start with something engaging. Number 5, know your bottom line. And number 6, no one cares how much you know until you tell a story.